Right now, as you are watching this, more than 300,000 people across France and Spain have been forced from their homes as wildfires tear through southwestern Europe, in what officials are describing as an unprecedented, still unfolding situation. Two massive fires burning west of Madrid have grown so large that Spain's military emergency unit is working around the clock just to keep them from merging into a single, uncontrollable blaze. In France's Gironde region, the fire has become so intense it's generating its own thunderclouds, a rare and genuinely dangerous phenomenon. And on Italy's southeastern coast, the Coast Guard just rescued more than 400 tourists and swimmers who had absolutely no escape route left except the sea. This is happening across 3 countries simultaneously, and it's unfolding right now. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's burning, why this fire season has become so extreme, and what's actually driving this disaster across an entire region of Europe at once. If you want to stay on top of this as it develops throughout the day, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering this breaking situation as new information comes in from officials on the ground. Let's get into it. Let's start with the numbers, because they've been escalating by the day. As of the most recent reporting, more than 300,000 people have now been displaced by these wildfires across France and Spain combined, with more than 100,000 formally evacuated, including nearly 30,000 people from the Madrid region alone. In Spain specifically, fires are affecting roughly 50,000 people across the wider Madrid region, with at least 10 communities evacuated or in the process of leaving. The epicenter of the Spanish crisis is a stretch of mountainous terrain in San Martín de Valdeiglesias, a town sitting between Madrid and Ávila. 2 separate fires have grown large enough that they're now touching at certain points along a 14 to 15 kilometer strip, roughly 9 miles. Spain's military emergency unit has made keeping those 2 fires from fully merging one of their central operational priorities. The Spanish government has deployed 2,737 personnel, 426 ground vehicles, and 21 aircraft to fight these fires, a genuinely massive mobilization. They've been joined by additional crews sent from Greece, Italy, and Portugal. The human toll on the ground is stark. The town of Navas del Rey, home to roughly 3,400 people in the Madrid region, has been completely emptied. Authorities evacuated the entire population after fire swept through the surrounding mountainous areas, and the town has remained deserted since, with thick columns of smoke still visible rising from the mountains nearby. Even critical infrastructure hasn't been spared. The Madrid Deep Space Communications Complex, a NASA-operated facility used for tracking spacecraft, was among the sites evacuated as the fires spread. Across the border, France's Gironde region, in the country's southwest near Bordeaux, has been dealing with its own escalating emergency. French authorities ordered new evacuations covering at least 5 separate towns, with residents directed via emergency phone alerts to move toward Bordeaux, where thousands are now sheltering from the fires. The Parc des Expositions de Bordeaux-Lac, a large exhibition center, has been converted into one of the main reception facilities for displaced residents, alongside the Parc des Expositions in Bordeaux itself. The French response has matched the scale of the emergency. Authorities deployed an enormous military cargo plane to assist in the firefighting effort, alongside a wide range of additional civilian and military resources, supplemented by a surge of foreign aid arriving from allied nations. French President Emmanuel Macron publicly praised the country's unity throughout the crisis and thanked the international allies providing support. Here's the detail from this disaster that deserves the most careful explanation, because it connects directly to something we've covered on this channel before in the context of Canada's wildfire season. Reports describe Europe's fire in Gironde as a rare and dangerous type capable of creating its own thunderclouds, technically known as pyrocumulonimbus clouds. As we've explained before, this happens when a fire becomes intense enough that the extreme heat rising off the flames punches a column of hot air and smoke high into the atmosphere, sometimes reaching altitudes comparable to an actual thunderstorm. When that column interacts with enough atmospheric moisture, it can form a genuine cloud, and in extreme cases, that cloud develops into a full thunderstorm system generated entirely by the fire itself, complete with its own lightning. That lightning can then ignite new fires at a distance from the original blaze, entirely independent of any other trigger. The erratic wind patterns these fire-generated storms produce can cause a fire's spread to become far more unpredictable than firefighters would expect from wind and terrain alone. A fire capable of generating this kind of weather system isn't simply a large fire. It's a fire that has effectively become a self-sustaining, partially unpredictable atmospheric phenomenon in its own right, which is a significant part of why this specific blaze has proven so difficult to fully contain despite the scale of the response deployed against it. While Spain and France have drawn the bulk of international media attention, Italy has been dealing with its own serious wildfire emergency simultaneously. The Italian Coast Guard confirmed it rescued more than 400 tourists and swimmers from a fire burning at Calamanicore, a seaside location within the municipality of Peschici, on Italy's southeastern Apulia coast. According to the Coast Guard, the fire had left absolutely no escape route for those trapped except by sea, a detail that underscores just how quickly and completely some of these fires have been able to cut off normal evacuation routes entirely. This kind of coastal entrapment scenario represents one of the more genuinely frightening categories of wildfire risk, precisely because it removes the standard evacuation options people typically rely on. When a fire's spread cuts off every road-based escape route simultaneously, as appears to have happened at Calamanicore, maritime rescue becomes the only remaining option. It depends entirely on having capable rescue assets, in this case, the Italian Coast Guard, close enough and ready enough to respond before the situation becomes fatal rather than simply frightening. Beyond the immediate danger to people directly caught near the flames, this scale of simultaneous wildfire activity across 3 countries also carries a significant public health dimension for populations well outside the fire perimeters themselves. Smoke from fires of this size and duration travels considerable distances, and, as we've discussed on this channel in the context of other major wildfire seasons, the fine particulate matter in wildfire smoke can affect air quality across an enormous downwind area, well beyond the communities directly under evacuation orders. Residents across Madrid, Bordeaux, and the wider surrounding regions, even those not facing any direct fire threat to their homes, may still need to monitor local air quality advisories closely as these fires continue burning, particularly anyone with existing respiratory or cardiovascular conditions, children, and older adults. There's a specific detail from Spain's firefighting effort that deserves its own explanation, because it's a genuinely unusual complication that most wildfire coverage never has to address. Firefighters battling the blaze in Val d'Uixó, in Spain's eastern Castellón province, are facing an additional and unexpected danger, lingering unexploded ordnance dating back to Spain's civil war nearly a century ago. According to Valencia's fire chief, Xevi Bolomar, the mountainous terrain around Val d'Uixó was once home to significant military positions during that conflict, and munitions from that era remain buried and, in some cases, live within the terrain firefighters are now working through. That combination, active wildfire and buried historical ordnance, adds a genuinely unusual layer of danger for ground crews, since intense heat and the physical disturbance caused by firefighting operations both carry some risk of triggering decades-old unexploded munitions. This forces crews to balance the urgency of containing the fire against this additional, largely invisible hazard beneath their feet. Understanding why this specific fire season has escalated so dramatically requires looking at the broader pattern building across Europe this year. According to data from Copernicus, Europe's climate change monitoring service, France has already experienced 3.4 times as many wildfires as its annual average so far in 2026, while Spain has seen 1.7 times its typical annual total. Those aren't marginal increases. They represent a fire season significantly outside the range these countries have historically experienced. The mechanism driving this pattern will sound familiar if you've watched our previous coverage of heat drought compound events this summer. Europe experienced an unusually wet winter this year, which produced abundant vegetation growth across the region. Then, as this summer's repeated heat waves set in, that same vegetation dried out rapidly, converting what had been unusually lush landscape into what researchers and officials are now bluntly describing as a tinderbox. This week specifically, the region is experiencing its 4th heat wave of the summer, with temperatures expected to spike to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, adding yet another rapid drying cycle directly on top of ground that was already critically primed to burn. Juliji Pausas, a researcher at the Center for Research on Desertification in Valencia, Spain, described the current fires in blunt terms. This is exactly what scientists have expected. For decades, researchers have warned that continuing to drive up global temperatures would produce a significant increase in the frequency, size, and intensity of wildfires. Pausas' assessment is that what's currently unfolding across Spain, France, and Italy is a direct, predictable manifestation of that long-standing warning rather than some unprecedented, unexplainable anomaly. The scale of this disaster has triggered a genuinely coordinated multinational firefighting response. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez confirmed that Greece, Italy, and Portugal have all sent resources and personnel to support Spain's firefighting effort, on top of the substantial domestic deployment already described. Sánchez visited the site of the wildfires directly and urged emergency workers to keep up their efforts, specifically framing this coming weekend as representing a window of opportunity to gain meaningful ground against the blaze, an assessment tied directly to expected shifts in wind and temperature conditions. This kind of rapid, cross-border mutual aid has become an increasingly common feature of major European wildfire seasons in recent years, reflecting a recognition among neighboring governments that a fire crisis severe enough to displace hundreds of thousands of people in one country represents a genuine regional emergency deserving of a genuinely regional response. This is not simply a problem for the affected nation to manage entirely on its own, particularly given how thinly stretched any single country's firefighting aircraft and personnel can become when multiple large fires are burning simultaneously within its own borders. Europe has lived through severe wildfire crises in the same general region before, and it's worth understanding both the parallel and the distinction, because it explains why officials and researchers are treating this particular season with such heightened concern rather than filing it away as simply another difficult but familiar summer. Back in the summer of 2022, France's Gironde region experienced a genuinely severe wildfire crisis of its own, one that, at the time, required evacuating roughly 14,000 people and deploying over 100 firefighters to bring the flames under control, with authorities scrambling additional water-bombing aircraft as hot, swirling winds fed the spreading blazes. That 2022 season was, at the time, described in similarly dramatic terms: a heat wave broiling much of Europe, tinder-dry vegetation, and a scramble of firefighters and aircraft racing to contain multiple fronts simultaneously. Spain and France both experienced fatalities that year as well, alongside thousands of additional evacuations. What makes the current 2026 crisis notably more severe by direct comparison is scale, where the 2022 Gironde evacuation order affected roughly 14,000 people. This year's combined France-Spain evacuation total has already surpassed 300,000, more than 20 times larger. Where 2022's crisis was described in terms of hundreds of firefighters and additional aircraft, 2026's response has required a coordinated multinational deployment involving thousands of personnel, hundreds of ground vehicles, over 20 aircraft, and support crews specifically sent from 3 separate neighboring countries. And where 2022's fires, as severe as they were, didn't produce the kind of self-sustaining pyrocumulonimbus fire clouds we've described in this video, this year's Gironde fire has crossed that threshold, a genuinely different category of fire behavior than what the region experienced just 4 years earlier. Copernicus's own data, confirming France's fire totals are running at 3.4 times its historical annual average, isn't just a comparison against a distant historical baseline. It's a direct quantified confirmation that this season represents a meaningful escalation even against a region that has already experienced serious wildfire crises within recent memory. It's worth understanding the specific tool European fire agencies use to anticipate exactly this kind of extreme fire behavior before it fully develops, because it helps explain how officials were able to see this danger building in advance rather than being caught entirely by surprise. European fire services rely heavily on a metric called the Fire Weather Index, which combines several measurements: air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and the number of days since meaningful rainfall, into a single composite score representing how readily vegetation in a given area is likely to ignite and how fast any resulting fire is likely to spread. This index is precisely why officials could describe the vegetation in these affected regions as a tinderbox, with real confidence well before the current fires actually broke out. Europe's unusually wet winter had already been factored into fire agencies' seasonal risk modeling as a double-edged development, welcome for water reservoirs and agriculture in the short term, but a genuine long-term fire risk factor once that same lush vegetation growth inevitably dried out under sustained summer heat. As each successive heat wave pushed temperatures higher and humidity lower across the affected regions this summer, fire weather index readings across large parts of Spain, France, and Italy would have been climbing steadily into the categories fire agencies classify as extreme, the exact conditions under which a fire, once ignited by any spark, whether from lightning, machinery, or human activity, becomes extraordinarily difficult to contain using conventional firefighting methods alone. That's precisely the environment official reports describe converging on Gironde, Madrid, and Apulia simultaneously this week, and it's a significant part of why so many resources were mobilized so quickly once these specific fires actually broke out. It's worth connecting this disaster to the broader pattern we've discussed on this channel throughout this summer. Intense heat dries out soil and vegetation faster than normal seasonal rainfall can replace that lost moisture, a process that can prime a landscape for extreme wildfire risk within just a matter of weeks. Europe's unusually wet winter, followed by repeated summer heat waves, represents almost a textbook illustration of exactly that mechanism playing out at a continental scale, with this current wildfire crisis representing the visible, devastating consequence of that underlying dynamic. With a fourth heat wave already arriving this week, and Copernicus data confirming both France and Spain are running dramatically above their typical annual fire totals, with a significant portion of the traditional summer fire season still ahead of them, there's a real possibility that this specific crisis, as severe as it already is, may not represent the final chapter of Europe's 2026 fire season. It may instead be one especially intense episode within a season that remains active and, based on current heat forecasting, likely to continue generating further risk across the region in the weeks still to come. more than 300,000 people displaced, fires large enough to generate their own thunderstorms, coastal communities cut off so completely that rescue by sea became the only option, firefighters navigating buried wartime ordnance while trying to contain flames racing across tinder-dry terrain. Taken individually, any one of these details would be a significant story on its own. Taken together, unfolding simultaneously across 3 countries within the same handful of days, they represent a genuinely unusual convergence, and one that officials on the ground have been explicit about connecting to the broader climate pattern researchers have warned about for decades, rather than treating it as a series of unrelated coincidental local emergencies. This is what's unfolding across France, Spain, and Italy right now, in real time, as this video is being made. It's a disaster driven by a specific, well-understood, and increasingly familiar mechanism, an unusually wet winter's vegetation growth meeting, a summer of repeated, intensifying heat waves, exactly the kind of compound climate event researchers have been warning about for decades. The international response has been substantial, and officials are cautiously describing a window of opportunity this weekend to finally gain the upper hand. Whether that window holds, and whether more of Europe's summer still has similar crises ahead of it, is exactly what we'll be tracking closely in the days to come. It's also worth remembering, amid all of this, that the response effort itself represents a genuinely remarkable coordinated undertaking. Thousands of firefighters, hundreds of vehicles, dozens of aircraft, and personnel drawn from 4 separate countries are currently working simultaneously across 3 national fire crises, a scale of mutual aid that would have been difficult to imagine mobilizing this quickly, even a decade or 2 ago. That response doesn't undo the displacement, the destroyed land, or the very real dangers still facing communities near these fires, but it does represent the kind of serious, well-resourced institutional response that gives affected communities a genuine fighting chance against a fire season this severe. Drop a comment and tell me if you or anyone you know has been affected by these fires, or if you're currently anywhere in the region watching this unfold yourself right now.